Hi everybody. Let's talk about Russian consolidated government budget and three weak pillars of economy, at least in my opinion. First, let's talk about non-oil and gas revenues, and then we will talk about oil and gas revenues. In 2022, non-oil and gas revenues exceeded the initial 2022 government target despite the expansion of the use of tax privileges, accelerated refunds of export value-added tax, deferrals for social insurance premiums, value-added tax and other taxes, cancellation of personal income tax on interest accrued on deposits, custom privileges and others. Additional non-oil and gas revenues largely resulted from the favorable environment in external trade, mineral extract tax, and export duties for non-oil and gas commodities like grain and coal. As a result, the government was able to allocate a record high amount of extra revenues to finance the current budget expenditure. Specifically, the unscheduled 10% indexation of pension and social benefits from June 2022 and increased expenditures for servicing government debt, which rose by 22.7% due to expansion of government debt, and raised wages to the social segment of the public sector at the regional level because of increase in the average monthly wage across Russia in general. The non-oil and gas revenues of the consolidated budget totaled 41,488 billion rubles, and 6% increased against 2021 non-oil and gas revenues. The decrease in revenues resulting from the tax privileges, deferrals, and the cancellation of certain taxes and non-tax revenues was offset by the one-time revenues. Part of increase in non-oil revenues in other category is transfer of dividends from the state-owned companies in amount of 753 billion rubles, increase from 290 billion rubles transferred in 2021 and 640 billion rubles transferred in 2020. Revenues of the Russian fiscal system in 2022 totaled 53,074 billion rubles, which is 10.3% higher than in 2021. Nevertheless, the additional revenues turned out to be insufficient to cover the surging expenditures. The fiscal system's deficit in 2022 amounted to 2.1 trillion rubles. The resulting budget deficit was covered from the resources of the National Wealth Fund and internal borrowings. Besides, a part of the National Wealth Fund's resources was invested within the Russian economy, which became another factor helping fiscal policy boost domestic demand. In 2023, the increase in non-oil and gas revenues was driven by the expiry of a number of anti-crisis and easing measures from 2022, like deferrals for social insurance premiums, the indexation of the excise rates, and the recycling fee on new cars linked to the ruble exchange rate. Another drivers were higher import duties and value-added tax for certain goods, a rise in profit tax on liquefied natural gas exports, and the introduction of the excise duties on sugary drinks and other measures. In addition, the rise in non-oil and gas revenues was driven by expanding consumer demand, quickly rebounding imports in terms of value-added tax, the excise duties on imports, and the import duties, the recovery of automobile market in terms of the recycling fee and the excise duties on motor vehicles, and more acute staff shortages causing a surge in wages subject to the personal income tax at the increased rate of 15%, for example, for front-line military personnel. Another contributor to the growth of revenues was one-time payment, including the windfall tax, over 300 billion rubles, and flexible export duties linked to the ruble exchange rate, approximately 140 billion rubles, high dividends from Sberbank, 300 billion rubles, and others. The non-oil and gas revenues of the consolidated budget totaled 50,251 billion rubles, and 21% increase against 2022 non-oil and gas revenues. Besides usual expenditures, the Constituent Territory of the Russian Federation financed additional expenditures of defense and security, as well as expenditure associated with the implementation of infrastructure projects, including from infrastructure budget loans, spending on the restoration and development of the country's new constituent territories increased: Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk, and Lugansk. Revenues of the Russian fiscal system in 2023 totaled 59,073 billion rubles, which is 11.3% higher than in 2022. Nevertheless, the additional revenues turned out to be insufficient to cover the surge in the expenditures, and the fiscal system deficit in 2023 amounted to 3.9 trillion rubles. The deficit was also financed primarily from the National Wealth Fund resources and domestic borrowings. In 2024, the Central Bank of Russia did not issue a report on consolidated budget, but non-oil and gas revenues increased by 19%. This increase was in correlation to rises of wages, 9.5% inflation rate, higher mineral extraction tax and other duties, and fiscal stimulus in form of subsidized interest rates on loans for strategic companies and on mortgages to households. The non-oil and gas revenues of the consolidated budget totaled 59,810 billion rubles, and 90% increased against 2023 non-oil and gas revenues. Revenues of the Russian fiscal system in 2024 totaled 70,941 billion rubles, which is 20% higher than in 2023. Nevertheless, the additional revenues turned out to be again insufficient to cover the surge in the expenditures. The fiscal system deficit in 2024 amounted to 3.2 trillion rubles. The deficit was financed primarily from the National Wealth Fund's resources and domestic borrowings again. And now let's talk about oil and gas revenues of Russia Federation. In 2022, despite the impact of the sanctions, the revenue part of the budget was supported by high oil and gas revenues because of the favorable environment in the hydrocarbon market and still a relatively high output of oil and gas commodities. Growth is attributed to the surge of revenue growth of mainly oil and gas companies because of high oil and natural gas prices. And another reason for the high oil and gas revenues was large one-time payment of mineral extraction tax by Gazprom, over 1.2 trillion rubles at the end of 2022. In 2023, total oil and gas revenues declined, which was the result of the sanctions, the reduction in the quantities of output and export of petroleum products because of the ban on export, lower export prices for commodities like nickel and others, and the decrease in the export duties on oil and petroleum products. In 2024, the Central Bank of Russia did not issue a report on consolidated budget, but the oil and gas revenues increased by 26% because of increase in mineral extraction tax. And in addition, Reuters estimates that minimum of foreign companies' payments for exit contribution to the Russian budget was 35.7 billion rubles. According to the Russian new law, they must sell companies for 50% discount and pay the exit contribution of 10% of the sale price to the budget. Interesting fact. Just Rosneft, the state-owned oil and gas company, contributed with 6.1 billion rubles to government budget, about 55% of oil and gas revenues. Company operated with oil production cap under OPEC Plus agreement, increased taxation, increased national monopoly tariffs, increased anti-terrorist security cost, it means Ukrainian tax on refineries, increased sanction pressures, and increased interest rates on loans, which increased expenses on loans and borrowings 150% in 2024. These circumstances resulted in 14.4% lower net income compared to 2023. In 2025, Russian government is expecting additional revenues from tax hike in the amount of 2.6 trillion rubles. 1.6 trillion rubles from increasing corporate income tax from 20 to 25%. 533 billion rubles from changes in personal income tax from 13% to 15% for incomes from 2.4 million rubles to 5 million rubles. From 15 to 18% from income from 5 million rubles to 20 million rubles. 20% on income from 20 million rubles to 50 million rubles, and 22% on annual income above 50 million rubles. The average monthly income in Russia for 2024 was 74,854 rubles, $830. In other words, Russians earned on average almost 900,000 rubles, $9,960 last year, less than twice the minimum threshold for the lowest bracket. But according to the Finance Ministry, around 2 million people, or 3.2% of Russian working population, would pay personal income tax. The mineral extraction tax is increased by 1.15 times for producing iron, 2.3 times for producing potash fertilizer, and 2 times for producing phosphate fertilizers. Also, extracting tax on diamonds and precious stones is increased from 8% to 8.4%, and extracting tax on iron ore mining is increased from 4.8% to 6.7%. Combined with mineral extraction tax on gold, this mineral extraction tax could boost tax revenues by 230 billion rubles. And where are the three weak pillars of economy? First weak pillar is decline in companies' profits. In 2024, tax revenues increased 20%, with social insurance revenues increased 21%, mineral extraction tax revenue increased 28%, and personal income tax 28% also. And also, value-added tax revenues in budget growth rate in 2023 and 2024 was about 20% either. But corporate income tax increased only by 1.6%. I think that is another indicator that Russian economy is in the trouble. Company profit was 31 trillion rubles in 2021, 29.4 trillion rubles in 2022, 5% decrease, 32.7 trillion rubles in 2023, 11% increase, and 30.4 trillion rubles in 2024, 7% decrease. And when we account the inflation rate, we can see huge decrease in companies' profits in 2024 of more than 17%. More companies is going to report losses, some because of high interest rates, some because of sanctions, and some because of cap prices by government, like Rostech military holding. And they all will be in need for money, loans, or they will lay off the workers, or they will increase the prices of goods and services. Maybe that oil and gas companies could once again make big exports and profits. Or wheat and commodities can be sold at record prices like in 2022. Or the central bank can print money like in 1998 and cause an inflation and exchange rate depreciation. Second weak pillar of Russian economy is tax revenues from occupied Ukrainian territories. Russia collected 118 billion rubles in tax revenues from occupied Ukrainian territories from January till September 2024. In 2023, they collected less than 118 billion rubles. Donetsk collected in 2024 56.7 billion rubles. Luhansk collected 38.7 billion rubles. Zaporozhye collected 14.9 billion rubles and Kherson collected 7.9 billion rubles. For them to contribute to regional budgets like an average Russian, 14,933 rubles for 2024, there must be population of 1,100,000 people. So, that is bad for mobilization into Russian army because there is too small of population in contrast to the whole of Ukraine. But before 2014, these regions have 5 million inhabitants. So if you deduct not occupied territories, let's say about 2 million people, and deduct refugees to Ukraine, about 3 millions, then they must have 3 million people. Now, we know for sure that 1 million is migrated to Russia proper, according to the World Bank data, and because of that, my estimation is that on 4 occupied territories today live about 2 million people, and they are paying half of taxes in comparison to average Russian. And that is not all. Additional financial burden to Russian budget is 350 billion rubles subsidies to occupied territories in 2024. And on top of that, Russian government have the same budget plan for 2025, 2026 and 2027. And the first weak pillar is population and workforce shift. Russia economy have decreased number of unregistered workers from 14 million to 13 million people. These 1 million men ended in military and in legal workforces, which is increased from 72 to 73 million people. The shortages of workforce came to be because 500,000 men emigrated amid 2022 mobilization, and new migrants from CIS countries don't go to Russia anymore because of the fear of the mobilization too. And I think shortages is in the military and in high educated workplaces. In every case, my conclusion is that they still have 13 million unregistered workers to employ in legal sectors. But fun fact, Russia had 73.6 million workers in 2023 and 73.2 million workers in 2024. We can say that 400,000 Russians was killed in Russo-Ukrainian war. At least I think so. What do you think? Write in the comment below.